The fog held low over the road, the kind that looks harmless until it swallows the edges of everything. The staff car's heater rattled, blowing air that smelled faintly of gasoline and wool. General George S. Patton sat in the right rear seat in a heavy overcoat, gloves on, a cap pulled low. He kept the glass clear with the back of his knuckles and looked out at the fields of the American zone in Germany. Black soil, broken brick, fence posts, leaning like old men. Up front, his driver watched the pale strip of pavement and eased forward past a convoy of slow trucks. Beside the driver sat the general's chief of staff, Hobart Gay, coat collar up, eyes narrowed. It was a quiet day after a war that had been anything but. The car topped a gentle rise and flattened out toward a rail yard on the city's edge. A coal haze hung over sidings and cranes. The driver dropped a gear to pass a pair of parked vehicles and brought the Cadillac back into the right lane. In the fog, a 2.5-ton truck appeared up ahead, angled toward them near a junction. Its cab was olive drab, a tarpaulin wrapped tight over the bed, the kind every unit used. The truck's driver looked left, then started across as if to pull into a side road. The space between both vehicles shrank into a breath. "Look out," Patton said, and the driver stamped the brake and swung the wheel. Tires screamed. The Cadillac's heavy nose dipped and skidded. The truck kept coming. The polished radiator met a steel stake on the truck's frame with a sound like a hammer on an anvil. The Cadillac stopped dead, the rear lifting a hand's width off the road before slamming back down. Glass cracked into a star. Luggage leapt forward from the rack and slammed the trunk. Gay lurched against the front seat and caught himself with both palms. The driver's cap flew off. In the back, Patton's head snapped forward. There was a brittle, internal sound. He folded, then slid sideways, awake, but suddenly emptied of motion from the neck down. Silence followed, big and wrong after the metal noise. Steam hissed from the radiator. The truck's driver climbed out white-faced, hands shaking. "Sir, I didn't see," he started, and stopped when he saw the man in the back seat. Gay reached in and cradled Patton's head to keep it still. The general's eyes were sharp and angry, then briefly confused as his body refused orders. "I think I'm paralyzed," he said, the words even and flat, as if reporting a map coordinate. A jeep flagged down a medic. An ambulance came with its bell clanging and a smell of ether already in the air. Litters slid out. The corpsman cut Patton's scarf and eased a collar around his neck, while Gay held his shoulders quiet. The driver stared at his hands and said the same thing twice. "I'm sorry, sir. They moved him as if the air could bruise him. At the station hospital in Heidelberg, white paint and tile swallowed the dark smells of cold iron and oil. X-rays hung on a light box showed a cervical vertebrae broken clean, the kind that slices strength away like a knife. Doctors said the words they must say, careful and certain. No movement below the neck, trouble with breathing, watch for clots. The general listened like a man reading a report he already knew the ending to. He asked about Gay and the driver. Both were bruised and shaken but whole. He asked about the truck driver, alive. He asked if anyone had died besides himself, and the doctor said no, and Patton nodded once, satisfied in a way that surprised even him. Outside the ward, the army did what armies do. A board convened. Witnesses who had seen the truck angle across and the car try to swing clear gave accounts that sounded like mirrors tilted at the same scene. Measurements were taken, skid marks chalked, photographs shot and labeled. The truck driver explained that his windshield had been partly iced and that he had misjudged the Cadillac's speed in the fog. Papers were signed. Findings were plain. Accident. Fault in the turn. No hint of intent. The board recommended instruction and discipline, not ruin. The army that had just finished tearing across a continent preferred order, even in sorrow. In the ward, Patton tracked time by the clock hands and the shift in light on the wall. Nurses moved like metronomes. He tried jokes first, out of habit. He told Gay to quit looking like that, said he'd be up by Christmas and then win another war just to prove a point. The words sounded like him, but landed like feathers. When the pain medicines ebbed, he talked about horses from his youth and the first time he smelled cordite in battle. He asked to be propped so he could see out the window. The winter trees were black against a sky the color of tin. He could hear traffic from the street and asked a nurse to open the window an inch to let in the sound of it. He said he hated being still. Everyone already knew. News moved faster than the cold. In mess halls, the story grew details it didn't need. In the American press back home, the man who had become a symbol of speed, audacity, and trouble was suddenly reduced to a bed and a list of vital signs. Friends went quiet. Rivals sent formal notes that were perfectly phrased and not entirely insincere. The general's wife came across the ocean to sit by his bed and hold the hand that could still feel. He asked her about home, then about the men under him who were already boarding ships. He said they shouldn't forget the graves over here. He said it twice. He told the chaplain he was not afraid, and it rang true, but there was a deeper thing running beneath it. Anger at the smallness of the end. A tank battle would have been cleaner. A bullet from a sniper would have matched the shape of his life. Instead, it was a truck and a turn in weather that every private learns to respect. He spoke about it once to Gay with a thin smile that wasn't a smile. "Hell of an exit for a cavalryman," he said. Gay took it like a confession and didn't answer. Complications came on quiet feet. A clot formed and traveled. His color changed, and his breathing grew shallow. The doctors did what doctors do: oxygen, prayer, precision, and the limits of all three. When the end arrived, it did so in the workmanlike way endings do in wards. A drop in numbers, a line that steadies where it shouldn't, a nurse who knows before anyone says the words. The staff stood still for a moment, because standing still is a kind of respect. Gay walked into the corridor and leaned his head against the cool wall. Outside, the city moved as if nothing had happened. It always does. Funeral orders were written clean and carried out crisply. A flag covered the casket. Men who had crossed rivers at his command took turns at the rails and didn't blink. He was buried among the soldiers of his army, not far from the roads he had pushed them down. The headstones stood in military rows, white against grass that would green again when the weather allowed it. Visitors who didn't believe in tears found they had them anyway. A woman pressed her palm flat to the stone and stayed that way until a guard, patient and gentle, guided her back to the path. Then came the whispers. They always come. A man who makes enemies risks rumors at his back. People who had argued with Patton in staff meetings or on the printed page suddenly became suspects in stories told in bars. An old intelligence hand claimed years later and far from the rules of evidence that shadowy men had wanted him quiet and used a wreck to do it. The tale sold magazines. It didn't match the file. There were no missing pages, no vanishing drivers, no altered times. The trucker had a name and a unit and a record of ordinary service. The driver of the Cadillac had a name, too, and lived with what he had seen as men do, with memory that wakes you early. The facts hold. A decorated general rode out on a gray morning to look at a country he had conquered and to occupy it with discipline. A truck cut across a road in poor visibility. A crash broke a neck. A hospital tried and couldn't change what the break had made inevitable. The most headstrong soldier in the American army left the world because metal met metal wrong, and because human judgment is not a weapon that always fires straight. Yet the other truth is harder and sits with those who knew him or thought they did. He was a man of armor and poetry, prayer and profanity, vanity and courage. He believed in destiny and in drilling until men lived by muscle memory. He loved glory and hated waste and could be both generous and cruel in a morning's span. On good days, he was the hammer needed for a hard job. On bad days, he was a storm inside a headquarters. In victory, he wore helmets that shone. In private, he wrote letters that sounded like a son seeking approval. The odd math of his life is that a simple accident could end a complicated man. When the American occupation turned from military to administrative, and then to the long, slow work of rebuilding, his absence was a gap measured not only in plans, but in noise. The army, ever practical, filled billets and moved on. The men who had done the moving did not forget the sight of a commander who never asked for a thing he wouldn't do himself. In the years after, some of them brought their families to the row of headstones and pointed, not to boast of knowing someone famous, but to explain a type of man hard to explain without a place to stand. Drivers on that same stretch of road still ease off the accelerator when fog comes down across the fields. They pass a small memorial stone not far from the tracks and glance at it the way drivers do, half seeing, half remembering what someone told them once. They do not slow because of ghosts. They slow because visibility is poor and because a mistake in such weather waits for anyone. If the general story keeps one driver from assuming he can see what he cannot, then the last lesson he gave came from a place he didn't choose, and so his career ended not with the thunder of guns, but with the thud of a collision and the quiet work that follows. In a war that taught men to fear sudden violence from afar, it was local, ordinary danger that found him, familiar vehicles, familiar road, a human error so plain that people wanted a different ending and invented one. The facts do not care. They remain. The memory, like the man, refuses to settle, and the argument about him continues wherever soldiers talk about ambition, command, and the weight of being the point of a spear. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.